Here's a question. What's the first thing you think of when I say the words adult animation? What's the first thing that pops into your head? If you live in North America, or any English-speaking country for that matter, the first thing you probably thought of was adult comedies. The Simpsons, Family Guy, South Park, Rick and Morty, these are by far the most popular form of adult animation we have, being adult because of their vulgar sense of humor or relevant pop culture parodies, and absolutely topping the charts in terms of viewers and publicity. Publicity that isn't always good though, because if there's anything most people know about these shows, it's that they don't look all that great. In fact, ask someone to name the worst looking piece of animation they've ever seen, and they might tell you something like Big Mouth. There are millions of videos dunking on shows like these for their distasteful art style or just overall lack of quality, and the best of the best are typically only okay, fine looking, but nothing special. The second kind of adult animation that you might have thought of then is a bit different. You have stuff like Arcane, Castlevania, Invincible, shows that are adult because of violence or dark mature themes, with more focus on long, intricate storylines than episodic sitcom-style adventures, and a much better reputation for visual quality. Yet, these are infinitely more rare than the cheap cash grab animated sitcoms that seem to get pumped out, and they take an enormous amount of effort to make. Arcane being in production for 6 years, and Invincible only putting out about 4 episodes once in a blue moon. But America isn't really the country known for this kind of animation, now is it? Because the much more obvious second thing that you might have been thinking about is anime. It's not a wholly unfair comparison. Japan has one of the largest animation industries in the world, right next to the US, and has an impressive amount of cultural exchange and influence worldwide. I mean, we all know who Goku is, you've seen a Pokemon before, there's a lot of crossover between the industries. But notably, there's a lot more really good adult anime out there. Adult anime that seems to be made faster, higher quality, and with more variety than most things America can put out, despite the whole industry being overall smaller than the US's. Like, don't get me wrong, Invincible looks pretty good, but I can go to any random seasonal show in Japan and it's probably gonna look just as good and also have a minimum of 12 episodes out a year. Arcane is like the best looking thing ever, but in the time it took them to make 9 episodes, Vinland Saga put out 48 that are by no means bad looking. There's some people out there who would say that anime is just objectively superior to Western animation, like as an art form, and that's insane. Go watch a Spider-Verse movie and get back to me. But in terms of adult stuff, it's certainly really far ahead. So much so that people confuse well-made adult animation in the US with anime all the time. Tomb Raider: The Legend of Lara Croft, a new show recently announced to be made by the studio behind Castlevania, was called the Tomb Raider anime despite being made in Austin, Texas. Castlevania even had the same thing happen, with the creators being adamant that they had people in the anime industry working on the show. I mean, I don't want to get into the whole what is an anime discussion. You want to say that Tomb Raider having an anime art style makes it one? Sure, that's valid. I don't care. But the fact that these shows get called anime so often, to the point that Netflix made a documentary called Enter the Anime just to promote them, kinda says everything you need to know. So I want to get to the bottom of this. I want to see why adult animation in the West seems to be so far behind anime when it comes to production and popularity. And more than that, I want to go through the history and context behind these two industries, talk about how anime and cartoons developed in these two major places, and figure out why they're so different. Because I think that context can give us a greater understanding and appreciation for the art form. And if you're interested in that too, then let's just get right into it. Part 1. The entire history of animation in the US and Japan. Specifically regarding adult stuff, it's interesting, I promise, please don't skip ahead. Animation as we know it was pioneered mostly in the US. Maybe not invented, since there's experiments in moving pictures going back hundreds of years, but certainly turned into an industry in the one place that's really good at doing that. One John Bray opened up an animation studio in 1914, literally patenting the process of moving pictures, because the other thing the US is really good at letting you do is abuse copyright. Earl Hurd, an animator at Bray's studio, officially invented the cell animation method, where in order to get a moving picture with many layers, you would paint everything onto clear sheets of celluloid. And Max Fleischer, out of that same studio, came up with the idea of rotoscoping, taking live-action film and drawing over it in order to get more realistic movement. Many innovations came out of early 20th century American animation studios, up until in the 1920s, when a young animator named Walt Disney would start making stuff out of his garage and eventually work his way up to founding his own, taking a risk on a big theatrical animation called Snow White. And I don't think you need to hear the rest. Snow White became the highest grossing film of its time, and Disney basically owns the world at this point. Now, early animation, while adding color and sound and voice acting and all these things, was still strictly a theater experience all the way up until the 1950s. Because, TV wasn't really a thing until then. So at first, it was these short little animated segments that would play in between other movies and just kind of fill out time at the theater, eventually leading up to full, feature-length Disney productions. But when TV did become a thing, airing those old cartoon shorts and movies as reruns became very, very popular, especially among children. So the natural progression was to start making cartoons specifically for those children in the early 50s, starting out as 5-minute shorts and eventually working their way up to full-length TV episodes, slotted right into the Saturday morning television block so you could watch them while eating your breakfast. One problem though. Making an entire television series at the same quality you were making a single short before wasn't feasible, so the idea of limited animation comes into play, where instead of drawing every single frame of a show, you would draw every other frame, sometimes every third frame, and then let everything sit still for a bit if not a lot was happening. Maybe reuse some cells here and there, cutting down on the workload and allowing a lot more to get done at the expense of looking cheaper.
That's the way to pitch, Rags. Now here's your big chance. One hit and we win the game.
This caused a big split in the way that animation was handled across the board, because one part of the industry, like Hanna-Barbera in the 60s, started focusing on limited animation, making tons and tons of episodes of shows like Huckleberry Hound for incredibly cheap, like less than $3,000 an episode cheap, going so far as to record all the sound in one day to keep everything under cost. And the other part of the industry, namely Disney, went all out on full animation with movies like Cinderella, which rotoscoped basically the entire thing to try and look as good as possible and cost over $2 million to make. Meanwhile, in Japan, they were still recovering from that whole World War II thing, and being occupied by the US for so long meant that a lot of American media made its way over and started exerting its influence. In particular, a young man named Osamu Tezuka became fascinated with cartoonists like Disney, taking up drawing and making comic books specifically to try and become a big famous creative like him. In the late 40s, Tezuka started publishing manga, and by the 50s he was fairly successful, with hits like Kimba the White Lion, New Treasure Island, and Ambassador Adam, one of which is most famous for a Your Movie Sucks video, and the other for featuring this little kid character that would go on to get his own spin-off in 1952, known in the West as Astro Boy. So manga as a medium fucking explodes. Tezuka's works are incredibly popular, more so than any artists of the last few decades. And while manga is blowing up, animation starts to get going as well. Specifically, a new company calling themselves Toei forms in 1956 with the bright idea to operate like an American animation studio. And by American Animation Studio, I mean Disney. They also wanted to be Disney. Everybody wanted to be Disney. In the early 60s, after getting their footing, Toei starts cranking out yearly animated movies based on popular folktales. Magic Boy, Alakazam the Great, Arabian Nights, the good old Disney formula. However, Alakazam the Great, also known as Sayuki, was actually based on one of Tezuka's works, an adaptation of Journey to the West, and so he was brought onto the production to help them out. Something that proved to be incredibly important to the history of animation, as Tezuka immediately fell in love with the medium. Though, while there are conflicting accounts, pretty much everything you'll hear about the production of Sayuki is chaos. Tezuka didn't feel like they had any creative control, other animators felt like Tezuka didn't do anything, and everyone was forced by the strict deadline that Toei gave them to finish the movie within the year. So, the man did probably the most Disney thing you could possibly do after this, and just started his own studio, Mushi Productions, then just poached all the animators he liked from Toei and went and did his own thing with them. Having such a bad experience with Toei though, Tezuka didn't like the idea of trying to be like Disney anymore. Or at least he didn't want to make big movies on tight schedules. So looking into other kinds of stuff to make, he reached back to the 1958 show Felix the Cat, which featured much simpler artwork, very few frames of animation, and long ongoing stories, much like the weekly serialized comics Tezuka was already familiar with. It was a match made in heaven, and the first show that Mushi produced on a weekly basis was their heavy hitter, Astro Boy. So just like manga, now television animation fucking explodes, becoming so popular that several more TV animation studios opened the year Astro Boy came out, with Toei even scrambling to start their own TV division just to compete, which was probably pretty hard after Tezuka stole all their employees. This marks an important distinction though, right? Animation in the US started on film and moved to TV over time, but the movies were still where all the focus was. These big budget features that attracted up-and-coming artists. So much so that the California Institute of the Arts was partially founded by Walt Disney as a pipeline to funnel talent into his studio. Meanwhile, Japanese animation took the form of TV and movies, but the television side was infinitely more popular, being helmed by the god of manga himself, who focused primarily on limited animation and tight budgets, with a lot of talent getting their start in the industry helping him. Or more specifically, getting their start working at Toei and then getting poached or leaving to go somewhere else. But then the other distinguishing factor that was majorly changing things was censorship. Despite how childish and quaint they might seem today, cartoons in the 10s, 20s, and 30s were actually very raunchy and mature. Betty Boop was a jazz-age flapper who constantly lost her skirt. Talkertoon's Bimbo was a sleazy womanizer, and Felix the Cat once tried to kill himself because he got a woman pregnant, in a very real short that came out in 1919. But with the Hays Code being enacted in 1934, something I've talked about at length, they put a stop to all of this. In response to criticisms from religious groups and the government, it prohibited almost everything that would have made animation more adult. Violence, sexuality, deadbeat dad-induced suicide, the whole lot. And fast forward to 1968, just when the Hays Code disbanded and TV cartoons became popular, you then have the assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr., which drove the US media wild all over again, especially towards depictions of violence in movies and television, causing such an upset around kids' media in particular that eventually television networks had people sit in on script meetings for animated shows to manually approve each episode, something they continued to do forever. You were not allowed to show violence. You were not allowed to imply violence. An episode of Josie and the Pussycats that aired in 1970 had to be rewritten because it featured a cat hiding in a bowl of spaghetti, and network censors said it would encourage kids to shove cats into spaghetti. That is a near direct quote. This is made worse by the fact that limited animation cartoons were entirely dependent on advertising revenue from cereal companies and other family-friendly brands, which only played in the Saturday morning and after-school blocks, making these blocks so competitive that the networks could maintain an iron grip on what shows got aired, letting them do whatever they wanted to your series because you couldn't put it out anywhere else. And all of this was on top of the already existing Comics Code Authority, which had started in the 50s, and had prohibited all that same adult content in any print media that wanted a mainstream release, effectively barring anything adult in any medium from getting its feet off the ground. Now, I'm not going to say there was zero censorship ever in Japan, or that you could do whatever the fuck you wanted. There have been some high-profile cases of shows being taken off the air, or manga being thrown out of store shelves, but this never got as big as it did in the US. And more importantly, it never really led to any active legislation or monitoring of what people could make. I mean, Tezuka had been adding adult jokes and themes to his works since basically the beginning. He included cross-dressing and androgynous characters in his early stories, and even an interracial kiss in Angel Gunfighter in 1949. In fact, he actually got quite upset that the American network said Astro Boy was too violent, one person reportedly calling the titular character a murderer because they destroyed other robots, a criticism that wasn't a thing when the show aired in its home country. In the 70s, anime actually started opening up to more mature themes following Tezuka, where Western cartoons did the opposite, which naturally opened the gates for artists in Japan to experiment with appealing to an older audience, culminating in the revolution that was the Gekiga movement. A short Japanese lesson, manga directly translates to something like whimsical pictures, and basically refers to kids' comics with rounded faces like Tezuka made. Gekiga means something like dramatic pictures, and has a more realistic, serious art style made for adults. We call all Japanese comics manga now, but for a good while there was a big distinction. So with Gekiga coined as a term by Yoshihiro Tatsumi in the 50s, he and his collaborators sought to make comics something that wasn't just for kids, telling stories of anti-authoritarianism and class struggle, and containing violence and shocking imagery. Many of these stories, like Ninja Bugecho by Sanpei Shirato or Takeo Saito's Golgo 13, becoming so influential that they inspired Tezuka himself to start writing works made for adults. Just focusing on Golgo 13 for a bit actually, it's a simple comic about a professional assassin who violently kills people, and it's the second highest selling Japanese comic of all time, just under One Piece. It also has a world record for number of volumes published. Gekiga basically caused a whole subset of the industry to mature overnight, with magazines like Garo and Tezuka's own Calm publishing these adult works to a broad audience. an audience that was then receptive to even more mature themes in their anime, like with Ashita no Joe, Lupin III, and Space Battleship Yamato. Another big anime studio that I haven't even talked about, Tatsunoko Productions, even experimented with Animentary Ketsudan in 1971. The first word of that title literally being anime and documentary shoved together, as it was an animated recounting of World War II history, talking about different battles in the Pacific all the way from Pearl Harbor to Japan's surrender. Mushi Productions even went so far as to create Anime Rama, a trilogy of movies made for adult audiences, including the first X-rated animated film in Japan, Belladonna of Sadness, which features full-on nudity, sexual assault, and depictions of Satanism. And I want to be clear, it did not do well. Cult classic now, a lot of people love it, but it's also partly responsible for Mushi going bankrupt the same year it came out. They might have gone too far in a few places. Now, funnily enough, the US actually did have this same sort of adult counterculture movement at around the same time, and I've actually talked about it before. It's the underground comic scene. Created mostly as a response to the censorship of the Comics Code Authority, it brought a bunch of violent, edgy stories to a mass audience, which alongside the Hays Code shutting down, resulted in big, adult-focused animations like Ralph Bakshi's Fritz the Cat, The Beatles' Yellow Submarine, and possibly my favorite title for a short film ever, Mickey Mouse in Vietnam. But these animations, yet again, were entirely limited to theaters, either full-length movies like what Ralph Bakshi was making, or short animated vignettes, and none of them, after Fritz, ever hit that same high. They were all independent productions that came out to smaller and smaller returns, and nothing ever crossed over to television. Bakshi's work still had a major effect on the industry. Fritz made over $100 million after all, but adult animation just didn't take off after it. And this is because of a big difference on just a fundamental level that I think sets these two industries apart. Structure. Because the anime industry was, and still is, incredibly fluid. There isn't a clear dividing line between movies or television or comic books or even live action. Someone will create a manga or light novel that gets popular enough for someone else to turn it into an anime series, that might even get popular enough for a film adaptation. And pretty much all animation was still limited, so the transition from show to movie wasn't that hard. An animator or studio who starts off on TV might go on to make movies and then come back to television years later. A famous movie star will play an anime character in their live-action adaptation. It doesn't really matter. It's all just part of this big ecosystem. One that was already incredibly popular with all audiences and had a broadening demographic focus. Since television and manga don't even have age rating systems, just different shelves and time slots they get put in, making them much more open to everyone, even if something is intended for a specific group, which allows audiences to experiment and watch different types of shows and movies, even adult ones, very easily. But in the US, that's not the case. Animated movies and TV were still considered very different. One was big budget spectacle that was now getting to be so expensive it had to appeal to the broadest audience possible, while the other was so dependent on advertising and network censors it couldn't get away with anything. The crossover was much more limited, both between animators and the properties they were animating, so people working in the industry just stuck to their lane, rarely branching out. There was no real crossover with live action, which meant that Hollywood got all the big mature stories, and they didn't even have the ability to rely on comic books like anime could rely on manga, which further stifled the variety of what was getting made. This all bleeds into the audience for animation in the West, who get so used to the one type of it that's consistently popular and profitable that they just start to associate all animation with kids shows and Disney movies. So even though Belladonna of Sadness was a flop and Fritz the Cat was a hit, the structure surrounding these two industries allowed adult anime to keep going where adult cartoons were held back. Belladonna was an evolution of the already existing mature content in anime, an experiment that could be repeated by theoretically any studio that had the resources, and audiences were growing more and more receptive to that kind of thing. Whereas Fritz the Cat was explicitly counterculture, a deviation from what cartoons were supposed to be, a one-of-a-kind flashbang of a film that nobody could even fathom becoming the norm. Going forward, anime directors would get the money and talent to make something like Belladonna again, but nobody had the power to change the West's perception of cartoons, confining the medium to a box that it didn't really break out of until decades later.
Cut! What the hell was wrong with that tape?
Also, just as a tangent, this difference in structure makes it so much more difficult to talk about adult-oriented animation comparatively, because with both countries having such different age rating systems, it's hard to define what even is adult when it comes to anime compared to cartoons. I mean, the term Gekiga is basically dead at this point, spoilers, so the thing to replace it was seinen compared to shonen anime. Golgo 13 now being officially labeled as a seinen manga, even though I think Takeo Saito would hate to call it that. But manga demographics don't often tell you the adultness of a work, because something like Spy Family, a wholesome story about a psychic child and her secret agent parents, was published right alongside Fire Punch, which is about a man surviving in the post-apocalypse while being constantly burned alive. Both of those are available to the same people, even though they appeal to different audiences. Pretty much the only hard distinction we have over who can watch what is Japan's film rating board, Eirin, which rates anything with a theatrical or home release, giving stuff a 15 or 18 plus if it's too over the top. But because what they consider over the top isn't even close to what the US thinks is over the top, stuff like Prison School and End of Evangelion got a G rating. So just going forward, when I'm talking about adult anime, I am talking about it from a Western perspective. Anime that is comparable in nature to adult shows in the US or would have a similar audience. Jujutsu Kaisen might be a shonen manga made for teen boys, but they also murder people, so I'd say it's fair to compare that with Invincible. Prison School might have a G rating, but a lot of kids in North America grow up watching Family Guy. The way we classify something as adult in both countries is very different, so a lot of it is up for debate. What's not up for debate though, at least in terms of adult anime, is like anything made in the 80s. Because with VHS and home video becoming this huge behemoth, a lot of people realized you didn't even have to go through the big networks at all. Despite not being as strict as the US, Japan still had limits on what you could show on TV or film. Networks and publishers still had final say on what aired, so extreme content was unlikely to get past them. But none of those limitations would apply to you if you just went straight to home video. And so the original video animation, or OVA, starts becoming a thing. And another one of the main freedoms of making an OVA was that you were no longer bound by the production deadlines and extra costs of television or movies. As long as you could keep your studio afloat and make your money back, you could make whatever and take however long to do it. Something that was especially easy with Japan's economy hitting all-time highs. So this opens the floodgates on experimental mature animation, and a ton of it comes out in quick succession. Dalos, released in 1983 and considered to be the first OVA, is a sci-fi drama depicting our heroes committing acts of space terrorism. Vampire Hunter D in 1985 was marketed as the first anime movie for adults because of its extreme violence and full nudity. Angel's Egg, that very same year, comes out with a similar abstract existential style to Belladonna of Sadness. Still didn't do well though. Mamoru Oshii was like blacklisted from the industry for several years after directing it, but hey, you gotta give him props for trying. After all, OVAs in general were making more money than ever. In 1983, the Japanese home video market pulled in about 2.7 billion yen in sales. By 1993, that number was 41.5 billion. And a large chunk of those sales come from the real adult anime that started to come out. Because as I said before, OVAs aren't held back by any restrictions on what they can include, aside from the law itself. So they were, of course, also responsible for the proliferation of animated hentai. Lolita Anime from 1984 is widely considered to be the first OVA of this kind, and immediately following it is the Cream Lemon series, which popularized animated hentai and the sexual bishoujo subgenre all the way until today. Now, this isn't the kind of video to cover that material in depth. I've talked about that stuff before. But if you want to do some research yourself, why not do it with the help of today's sponsor, Adam & Eve. Adam & Eve is the nation's largest adult toy store, with over 20 million very satisfied customers. They sell all manner of toys, accessories, and sexual wellness products for men and women that can satisfy whatever urges you may have. You want something that vibrates, something remote controlled, maybe the only thing that works for you is heavy machinery. Doesn't matter, with over 50 years in the business and thousands of products, I'm sure you'll find what you need. It should be obvious from how many videos I have on adult content that I'm a big believer in sexual wellness. I don't just think we should destigmatize enjoying sexy material, I think we should liberate ourselves when it comes to the way we do the deed, which is something that toy stores like Adam & Eve are all about. So with discreet shipping, 24/7 customer service, and a 90-day hassle-free return policy, you don't have to feel guilty about improving your sex life. Go check out a veritable cornucopia of copulation contraptions at adamandeve.com and use code LEX50 at checkout to get 50% off one item, free shipping to the US and Canada, and free rush processing. That's code LEX50 at checkout at adamandeve.com. Thank you to Adam & Eve for sponsoring the video. So with hentai and all of the stuff that followed it, this explosion of graphic content in the mid to late 80s should make it clear just how different things got between the US and Japanese industries. The US had some breakout hits that shook things up, like Who Framed Roger Rabbit, a movie that called back to the golden age of animation and blended it with a more noir-inspired Hollywood story. Also, Heavy Metal, which is a sci-fi fantasy anthology film inspired by a comics magazine of the same name. That one's made in Canada though, so fuck you, you can't have it. Yet, at the same time as all of this, Japan was putting out Wicked City and Urotsukidoji Legend of the Overfiend, which had excessive gore and erotic violence right alongside its heavy action and dramatic storylines, which is leagues beyond anything the US would ever think to animate. So much so that Urotsukidoji got screened at the Toronto International Film Festival, where Variety reviewed it saying, "Films like these are why the word misogynist was invented." Though the US's reaction to hardcore animation like Urotsukidoji never stopped it from becoming popular. In fact, a lot of OVAs became popular in the West for both adult and younger audiences, since there were still a lot of non-adult series being put out on video. The widespread release of all of these VHS tapes, laserdiscs, and later DVDs meant that there were a lot of people working to translate, subtitle, and re-release them internationally, which, just like how US culture seeped its way into Japan, spread the good word of anime all across the United States. Something that culminates in the release of Akira, this massive, big-budget production helmed by the creator of the manga himself, Katsuhiro Otomo, having super fluid animation that was uncommon in anime at the time, as well as heavily detailed artwork alongside a mature political story that was very reminiscent of Gekiga. And most importantly, it was a cyberpunk story that looked cool as fuck. Akira was a big hit in the US, becoming an instant cult classic despite not being a mega blockbuster. But whether it was that or Urotsukidoji or Bubblegum Crisis or any of the other anime that got a Western release, something started to crack the pristine, family-friendly shell that US animation had started to build up. Well, that and the creation of MTV. Founded in 1981, Music Television was a network that aired, well, music videos. A lesser YouTuber would have made the joke that some of you might not remember this because they stopped doing that in the 2000s, but I'm better than that. Also in the 2000s, I was a child. The whole channel being dedicated to rock and pop music in the 80s and 90s meant that it had a certain edge to it, one that was being pushed by one of its co-founders, Fred Siebert, who loved the idea of mimicking the aesthetics of local radio stations. And it was partly his decision to animate the 10-second network identifications that played in between the videos because, quote, cartoons seemed to be the closest visual equivalent to rock and roll. The 10 years of MTV that dominated television stations during the 80s pretty much defined the sort of weird, offbeat style of animation that would crop up coming into the 90s. Because as music videos started to die down, MTV replaced them with Liquid Television in 91, their dedicated anthology show that featured a rotating cast of short, strange-looking cartoons. One such cartoon was Aeon Flux, an avant-garde sci-fi series that took heavy inspiration from German Expressionism and featured much more violent and sexual material than any animated TV in the US at the time. You also had adult comedies like Beavis and Butthead, dark superheroes like The Max, alongside a ton of one-off shorts by various artists. It makes sense that the transition from music video to adult animation would be smoother than starting from children's cartoons, and so where Hanna-Barbera and Disney were the standard before, now MTV became the blueprint for everything animated and adult, even today. I mean, Fred Siebert went on to become the last president of Hanna-Barbera in 1992, up until the company was absorbed by Warner Bros., during which time he started his own self-named studio, Frederator. But alongside rock and roll aesthetics comes the birth of something equally important, the adult animated sitcom, a cartoon version of the largest television genre in America, and seemingly only America, because almost nowhere else has it consistently topped ratings charts for the better part of half a century. But it did, and so naturally people thought to replicate this success outside of live action, resulting in one of the most famous animated shows of all time. Say it with me now, The Flintstones. Released in 1960 and made by Hanna-Barbera, this goofy little series featuring a family from the Stone Age would air on ABC as the first primetime cartoon ever, becoming immediately popular with both children and adults and capturing the sitcom formula and audience perfectly. It's incorrectly cited as being the first sitcom to show the couple sleeping in the same bed together, but despite that, it did genuinely push forward people's perception of animation. And turns out, anything that resembles I Love Lucy just does really well, so the Flintstones became the most profitable, most successful, and longest running network animated franchise in the US for 3 decades. Up until The Simpsons. Now, you might have heard that The Simpsons started on the Tracy Ullman Show. That's a fun piece of trivia people like to throw around.
The original Simpsons shorts, they were like interstitials for another show.
Wait, really? I actually didn't know that.
But that Tracy Ullman appearance was born out of a combination of success of the last two things we talked about. Tracy Ullman was a very popular British comedy actress in the 80s, who had started multiple series in Britain before moving to the US in 1987, and with the help of producer James L. Brooks, decided to pitch her own sketch comedy program for the then brand new network Fox. The show was pretty experimental with a lot of its bits, and so when thinking of a way to transition from one to another, or from a sketch into a commercial break, in part due to the recent success of MTV, one of the first things that came to mind was animated shorts. In particular, a weird yellow dysfunctional family that was drawn up by comic strip creator Matt Groening.
Hold it, everybody. We forgot to say grace.
Say, good drink, good meat, good God, let's eat.
These animated shorts then proved to be so popular that they would become their own full-fledged segment on the show, before getting spun off into their own. And so popular that Tracy Ullman would later sue The Simpsons for a share of their profits. Which is fair, I think I'd probably do that too after seeing how much money it made. The Flintstones was already a surprisingly mature cartoon for the time it was around, but The Simpsons is really what took the idea of the animated sitcom and ran with it. And one of the reasons it became so forward-thinking and adult-oriented was because it was created at just the right time when Fox as a network was still really young. So James L. Brooks, leveraging his success from Tracy Ullman and years of experience, was actually able to secure a contract that made sure the network was unable to interfere with the writing of the show, in what I think is pretty much a first for animation since network censors became a thing. They couldn't get away with everything, they still had to cut stuff, but they got away with a lot more than every other show that came before, which is a pretty big turning point for adult animation in the West, and why pretty much every show I'll talk about from here on will be able to trace some lineage back to this dysfunctional yellow family. That, or the two other shows that set the standard for animation in the 90s, because a lot of important stuff came out then, bear with me. On the kids' side, one John Kricfalusi, who got to start working on Hanna-Barbera shows, and his big break actually working under Ralph Bakshi, pitched a show to Nickelodeon called Ren and Stimpy. This off-the-wall cartoon with an absurdist sense of humor and insanely vulgar and offensive sensibilities. On the adult side, two film students with a shared love of Monty Python wanted to pitch an animated comedy to Fox. It would star 4 kids living in the fictional town of South Park, Colorado. Weirdly enough, Fox seemed more than willing to hear them out, probably because they smelled money coming from another animated sitcom, but Trey Parker and Matt Stone were so adamant that they be allowed to include a talking turd character named Mr. Hanky that they actually fought with the network and lost the deal. So, they went over to basic cable and got picked up by Comedy Central instead. Both of these shows, though obviously very different in many ways, both became known for being way more extreme than anything else. Ren and Stimpy had to cut a lot of bits, like someone burning the United States Constitution, or people smoking cigarettes in like every episode. And South Park, well, South Park has an entire Wikipedia page dedicated to all their controversies, so take your pick. But these shows, alongside Matt Groening's masterpiece and its successors like King of the Hill and Family Guy in 97 and 99, prove that doing an adult or even edgy show that pushed the envelope was actually a profitable thing to do in animation, so long as it was a comedy. You see, the West still hadn't really changed its mind over what cartoons were. Going into the 80s and 90s, there was perhaps even less confusion, because of the smash hit success of things like Transformers and Thundercats, shows made primarily to promote toy lines and cereal boxes, which leads to a lot of, just because there isn't a better word for it, insecurity from people who wanted to make cartoons for adults. This insecurity, combined with the legitimate difficulty of getting something like that off the ground, means that the best solution creators could come up with was to make something so extreme and opposite to kids' media that it couldn't be for anybody but adults. Yet violence and nudity were still off the table, so they get left with the only option they have.
Category is people who annoy you.
If there's any comparison to make, the closest anime equivalent would probably be the Gekiga movement. This sort of revolution to try and change people's perception of what this medium could be. But because of those years of insecurity and restrictions on content, these adult works tended to be parodies of themselves instead of legitimate attempts to make something fresh. South Park, Family Guy, Ren and Stimpy, even The Simpsons are all shows born out of the inherent joke that you're looking at what should be family-friendly cartoon characters doing vulgar and insane things. That's where a lot of the humor comes from. It's playing on the audience's expectations. And this works, it becomes insanely popular and paves the way for all of the adult animated shows we see today, but it also keeps the view of animation just as limited. Now animation is no longer just kids shows. It's kids shows and adult comedies, and that's it. None of this has broadened people's views, we've just split them into two equally narrow lanes. The adult lane still being held back by the idea that you're taking a childish medium and doing something dirty with it, typically in sitcom format. Compare this to what Japan was making at the time, and actually, what was Japan making in the 90s? Neon Genesis Evangelion. I don't know what the fuck that is. The OVA boom of the 80s obviously kept going into the 90s, though with new advancements in digital tech coming shortly after, and also that whole economic collapse because of the bubble economy thing, these indie studios started to shrink down a bit, converging back into the mainstream big network productions. But the influence was still apparent, and anime movies in the 90s became defined by two things. One was a headier, more intellectual focus, as apparent in stuff like Ghost in the Shell, End of Evangelion, and Perfect Blue. Not just mature because they showed boobies and blood everywhere, but also because they were full of nuance and plot threads open to interpretation, suited to be dissected by those older than 12. And the other thing that started to define the era was a further increase in quality of animation, a movement spearheaded by Mamoru Oshii, Satoshi Kon, and Hayao Miyazaki, who were all kind of fed up with the limited style that Tezuka had pioneered, with Miyazaki in particular coming out with Princess Mononoke, the most expensive anime movie ever made, which became the highest grossing anime movie ever made in both Japan and America at the time, despite the fact that it was a serious drama with excessive violence. In fact, when the movie was first playing in America, Harvey Weinstein reportedly reached out to Studio Ghibli to try and pressure them to cut the film down to a PG-13 rating, to which Miyazaki's producer, Toshio Suzuki, reportedly responded by flying to the US, gifting Weinstein a replica katana, and yelling, "No cuts!" Anyways, on the TV side of things, shows followed a similar growth, with Evangelion becoming both such a big hit that it led to a new boom in anime productions, but also being so controversial, violent, and overtly sexual that TV Tokyo started to crack down on adult content in anime. See, when I talked about Japanese TV not having any ratings, I kinda left that it results in them being pretty strict about time slots. Evangelion, for example, actually aired at 6:30 p.m. after school, taking up the slot that used to be filled by Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, of all things. In fact, there's a really funny video of the whole Japanese cast of TMNT saying goodbye after the final episode, and then immediately cutting to a commercial for Ava. So TV Tokyo got really mad at Ava for being so unkid-friendly, cracking down on a lot of the shows that came after and more closely monitoring their productions, and taking out a lot of that anger on Cowboy Bebop, which came out a few years later. This time putting their foot down and just not allowing any of the more violent episodes to air, meaning the show only put out half of its 26 episodes out of order on its usual 6 p.m. space, only getting a full release half a year later on Wow Wow, the Japanese equivalent of HBO. This actually became sort of a recurring problem for big TV networks, because they were starting to get nervous about airing such adult stuff during daylight hours. Stuff that wouldn't have been made before, but because of the OVA boom was now incredibly popular. So their solution to this was to open up late-night television blocks specifically to run these more mature shows. Cowboy Bebop's Wow Wow run was actually at 1 in the morning. Tokyo TV opened up its 1:15 a.m. slot to shows like Serial Experiments Lane, Trigun, and Boogie Pop Phantom. And Nippon TV opened its first late-night block with Berserk 1997 at 1:45. Tokyo TV even opened one of their most famous, or perhaps infamous, subsidiaries, ATX, a premium anime-focused television network that was allowed to get away with showing series fully uncensored during its late-night broadcast, leading to it airing everything from Elfen Lied to High School DxD to Redo of Healer. In the manga space, the 90s was actually probably the closest that Japan really got to American-level censorship regarding adult media, because at the same time these time slot changes were happening, Arrow manga was also subject to the adult comics label, where works that were considered unsafe for kids were given a special R18 mark and their own section in stores, essentially making every magazine either okay for all ages or X-rated hentai. But again, the controversy around adult comics in Japan being around largely pornographic material just goes to show how different things really were. Suffice to say, this tradition of airing anime super late at night became sort of a staple of most TV networks, and actually continues to this day, with pretty much any anime show that's not meant for kids being put out between 9 p.m. and 2 a.m. Partly because of those initial restrictions on content, but also because it's much cheaper to air shows at that time, and anime almost always makes most of its money through Blu-ray or manga sales anyways. And you're probably familiar with the US's attempt at late-night animated programming because it became even more influential, in particular with Cartoon Network's Adult Swim and Toonami. The latter was actually created specifically as a programming block to host one show, which then moved over to the former. That show being Space Ghost Coast to Coast, a series spawned entirely from the decision of Cartoon Network executives to create a cartoon that appealed to adults, to compete with the likes of Beavis and Butthead and The Simpsons. The person they asked, Mike Lazo, decided to use old clips they had from Hanna-Barbera cartoons, specifically Space Ghost from 1966, alongside some clever editing and image manipulation to create an entirely new program, where this masked superhero would interview celebrities with this strange, purposefully awkward pacing and surreal sense of humor.
No, it's his brother, avenging the death of his twin. It's his twin brother!
Really?
I'm gonna follow him home. Kill his whole family.
Airing at 11 p.m., Space Ghost Coast to Coast immediately found a huge cult audience of late-night viewers who appreciated its creativity and charm. So much so that Cartoon Network put it front and center of its new afternoon animation block, Toonami, and made Space Ghost characters the hosts, before eventually replacing them with a network original, Tom.
So it's a brand new Toonami, but the mission objectives remain the same. My name is Tom. I'm the new Moltar.
And with Tom came the introduction of Toonami's Midnight Run, probably the thing that most of you know it for. Their late Saturday programming slot that aired almost exclusively anime. Stuff like Dragon Ball Z, Sailor Moon, Outlaw Star, and Gundam. These were still considered pretty adult shows in the US, so they got stuck to the midnight time slot that allowed them to remain uncut. But this was a huge leap in not only maturing the network, but bringing anime into the mainstream in the West. By the height of Toonami's popularity, about 1/3 of all viewership on Cartoon Network was adults. People who came for the all-ages cartoon shows during the day who would be more willing to stick around late at night for something more for them. This then gave Mike Lazo another idea, to create a dedicated adults-only block on CN that would be able to handle more original programming. And so Adult Swim was born in 2001, the week before 9/11. That's not important to the story or anything, by the way. I just think it's crazy they premiered Adult Swim 9 days before 9/11. That's just a weird fact to me. And as most of you know, alongside the original programming it debuted with, like home movies, also came the first American broadcast of Cowboy Bebop, which damn near instantly became the most famous anime the West had ever seen. Anyways, Adult Swim sort of fit the puzzle pieces together. We had an audience willing to see more mature animated programming, we had creatives influenced from the likes of MTV who wanted to make that stuff, we had network executives willing to greenlight it after the success of The Simpsons, and now we had a channel to air it on. One being programmed entirely by William Street, the company behind Space Ghost, owned by Mike Lazo. Following the success of a lot of the major shows and networks we've talked about, more adult cartoons than ever get pitched and made in the 2000s. Venture Bros, Aqua Teen Hunger Force, Futurama, Harvey Birdman, Robot Chicken, Clone High. I could list shows for like 10 minutes and someone would still leave a comment talking about how I missed their favorite. Now, notably, almost every single one of these is still a comedy, and for every generational success you have 10 shows that didn't make it past a first season. But still, it's immediately apparent that cartoons for adults are here to stay. And with the rise of the internet, anime is only growing more and more popular worldwide every year. Sites like Crunchyroll and Funimation start to take off. Ghibli wins the Oscar for Spirited Away. In 2006, there are 195 new animated shows being broadcast on Japanese television. So this leads to a lot more crossover between these two industries, because anime starts to become a more tangible influence as people start to see how far ahead it is, and we start to get anime-inspired shows. Not just like Avatar: The Last Airbender, but like The Boondocks, which is made in the US with the clear intent to look like something from Japan. Also, you have the insane success of shows like Death Note, Attack on Titan, Tokyo Ghoul, and Sword Art Online. Shows that become some of the biggest, most popular franchises in the West on the basis of them being considered dark and edgy. You know, I'm not like your other anime, in this one we fucking kill people or whatever. Fast forwarding into the mid-2010s, audiences were pretty much primed to start watching some more mature stuff that wasn't just comedy. They had been slowly expanding their tastes with foreign-made media, enough that there was some desire in the US. And what really set about to majorly change things and allow this stuff to get made was Netflix. See, anime had been growing and changing pretty slowly up until the OVA boom, and that's when all hell broke loose. And streaming services in the US had pretty much the exact same effect, for the exact same reason. Animation is expensive, and making it for a TV schedule is a lot of hard work for not that much payoff. The only shows producers could really afford to bank on was animated sitcoms, or really low-budget experimental stuff on Adult Swim. But out comes this new format for media where there are no rules and things start to change. Also, Netflix was just throwing money at people to make anything. As part of their big strategy to get people on the site, they famously made deals with production companies and directors to get them to make Netflix originals. And adult animated shows were a big part of that, with the company acquiring studios like Animalogic to make their own in-house stuff, then making sure Arcane and Castlevania were only available in one place. This then forced other streaming sites to try and compete, which leads to Amazon Prime Video starting up their own animation to make stuff like Invincible, which causes Netflix to make even more deals, ultimately pumping up the market to an unsustainable level that will cause the streaming economy to collapse in on itself like a black hole, but also giving us some pretty good cartoons, so who cares. Still, a lot of terrible animated sitcoms come out. They are still cheaper. But don't get me wrong, like 90% of old anime OVAs aren't great either. And with the trash comes some gold. We get Scavenger's Reign, we get Blue Eye Samurai, we get Love, Death, and Robots, which is explicitly a reboot of Heavy Metal, so you also cannot have that one. I am claiming that for the Canadians, fuck you. Here in the 2020s, we sort of finally get to where anime was heading in the 80s and 90s. You're seeing some more experimental stuff released on various platforms at their own pace. Western animation obviously had a lot of hurdles to get there that Japan just didn't, much more censorship and worse cultural perceptions of animation and a bunch of mishaps that sort of stunted the growth of this particular side of the medium, but I'd actually say that we're kind of over that hill. But if we really want to dissect the big split between these two industries, at least culturally, I don't think there's anything better to look at than otaku. If for some reason you don't know, otaku is broadly the Japanese equivalent to like nerd or geek, someone really invested in some sort of hobby where others might ridicule them for being childish or unmasculine. And though it is a Japanese word, I'll just be using the word otaku for both countries to keep things simple. Notably, the otaku spaces in both the US and Japan got their start in sci-fi. In the US, it was the popularity of pulp novels and especially shows like Star Trek back in the 60s, while in Japan, the big boom came around the creation of Gundam and space battleship Yamato. Both of these cultures then sort of shifted over from a focus on genre to the medium surrounding them, with American otaku becoming obsessed with comic books and TV, while Japanese otaku clung to anime and manga. And funnily enough, both sides started their premiere conventions within 5 years of each other, with San Diego's Comic-Con in 1970 and Tokyo's Comic-Ket in 1975. Now, a big feature of these conventions, and just of nerd spaces in general, wasn't just consuming this media, but creating your own. Because more generally than the genres or mediums that they're into, a lot of otaku can be defined as people who grew up with a certain thing they liked that they just continued to like into adulthood, making it easy for them to pursue a career, or at least a hobby, in that medium, and making it a big part of the otaku identity to take something made for a younger audience and turn it into this more mature work for your older self. This is something you can very clearly see in a lot of the creatives I've mentioned so far. Leiji Matsumoto grows up reading manga by Tezuka, they go on to create Yamato. John Kricfalusi grows up watching Huckleberry Hound, he goes on to make Ren and Stimpy. Seth MacFarlane loves the Flintstones as a kid, he makes Family Guy as an adult. There's this sort of loose 15 to 30 year cycle that pretty much all adult animation goes through, where a generation grows up inspired by a certain show, they get into the industry and into a position where they can make their own, and they make something more mature and self-referential for people who are also inspired by that thing, which then goes on to inspire the next generation. The key difference, at least between Japan and the US, being that Japanese otaku were allowed to flourish. Shows like Evangelion were made explicitly for this audience. The OVA boom sort of relied on the otaku space. As more and more anime came out and became more popular, that derogatory term lost its edge. It became cool to be an otaku, something exemplified by the literal Cool Japan program, where the government itself tried to embrace and promote this sort of culture. People like Hayao Miyazaki or even Hideaki Anno may be critical of otaku and how they operate. You'll see a lot of quotes just talking shit about them. But even this criticism is levied from the understanding that otaku run the anime industry at this point, which is why adult anime is just seen as another facet of the medium, one made for this older crowd who can appreciate it sincerely. Yet in America, there was no such luck. Whether it was censorship or backlash or the irreversible damage that Revenge of the Nerds did to everyone involved, American otakuism, especially around animation, was just never allowed to get off the ground. At least not until very recently. Sci-fi and fantasy and comic books all became huge, mostly because of the corporate takeover of a lot of their productions, but animation was just never cool to like as an adult. And the people that did try to push things never got traction. You try to make something mature and edgy like Ralph Bakshi, you're treated like a pervert. You even like anime at all until like a decade ago, you'd get shoved into a locker. So this void where sincere appreciation should be, gets inevitably filled with the insecurity that I talked about before. You'll read an interview with the creator of some new animated adult show, and they'll talk about wanting it to be taken as seriously as something live action. There's still this sort of comparative jealousy, where instead of making something good and original, you're trying to earn some sort of approval. So when you do make something for an adult audience like yourself, it's not for people who genuinely appreciate that kind of work, but for the people with your same kind of cynicism. And this isn't just limited to animation. I think shows like The Boys are a prime example of this. And thankfully we're at a point where not only is anime popular in the West, but more experimental shows are coming out. The influence of the internet is starting to take more effect, and we're getting some genuinely good stuff like Smiling Friends and the dozen or so shows on YouTube. Being in that sort of 90s OVA boom equivalent, we're just starting to see the American otaku become a real force of nature. People showing genuine appreciation and making things that are much more sincere. So with the 15 to 30 year cycle turning over, I have no doubt that adult animation will eventually get to the same place anime is, treated as a medium that can tell these complex stories that everyone can appreciate. The West may be far behind, but I don't think they're out of the race. Anyways, I feel like there was something else that I wanted to talk about. Oh yeah, part 2. Why does Big Mouth look like that? So we've answered a big question of why Western animation is so different and culturally far behind compared to anime, but we still have another big one to tackle. Namely, why do so many shows just look kinda shitty? And why do the shows that do look good take like 8 years to make, when anime seems to be pumping out quality animation consistently? Well, if you'll remember, one of the main early differences between anime and cartoons is that American animation at the top of the pyramid had a large focus on fluidity and detailed movements. Full animation, as it's called, with big Disney movies animating almost every single frame and rotoscoping the characters to make sure that they're flowing as smoothly and realistically as possible. You can see this in Disney's 2D Prime with the works of James Baxter, one of their premier character animators, who would draw some of the most insane-looking shots of movies like Beauty and the Beast completely by hand. But even normal and seemingly mundane shots had characters never sitting still and constantly moving and shaking and doing something that could be animated every frame. A holdover from the older rubber hose style animation from the 30s and earlier. Then of course, in Japan, animation got started from the limited side, with people mirroring Mushi Productions and Tezuka, where by default there were fewer frames of animation and more of a focus on interesting backgrounds and varied shot composition to make up for it. But because the entire industry was built on this, artists were able to try and perfect this style. One of the big buzzwords that you hear coming out of the anime community when talking about visual quality is sakuga. This term born out of the 60s and 70s, where Japanese animators were inspired by the likes of Disney to create something fluid, but in a way that fit the constraints of a limited production. So they would save up their effort for these big moments where you'd get a sudden burst of really high quality, dynamic, fluid animation for a single scene before going back to the more limited look of the rest of an episode. And these really high quality shots were called sakuga. In the 60s, these big sakuga moments were spearheaded by the likes of Yasuo Otsuka, but come the height of TV anime and you get people like Yutaka Nakamura making some truly spectacular stuff within a single episode of television. Most famously having the environment explode into perfect cubes so much that the trope was simply called Utapon cubes after him. What's notable though is that the West's focus on full fluid animation at all times for big budget productions left a lot of the limited TV shows in the dust. Disney and the Hollywood animated structure brought in so much talent to produce these massive films that they pretty much sucked the industry dry for anything else. Working on television as an animator meant way less pay, lower budgets, and less notoriety. You couldn't experiment or improve too much because you were barely delivering episodes on time as is, and animators were just waiting for their big break to leave and go work with the big boys. All of which drives the split between these spaces even further, leading to big movies looking better and better while TV had to catch up. whereas anime was this more open system, where the whole industry was pushing interesting uses of limited animation. They didn't have big studios like Disney for people to aspire towards, so instead they worked with what they did have and expected more and more out of TV shows. Sure, bigger studios had better looking stuff, a hierarchy still existed, but the talent is more spread around, there isn't a wall between TV and movies, and so everyone can more easily raise the bar of quality. Using Sakuga more and more, having more dynamic shots, and increasing the detail and complexity of their drawings. In other words, Western animation raised the ceiling of quality for their studios, while anime raised the floor. And I don't think anything illustrates this better than looking at how the two industries handled the introduction of CG. In America, a company you might know as Pixar was founded in 1986 after splitting off from Lucasfilm's computer graphics division. Being founded by the two geniuses who invented the Alpha Channel, having the talents of former Disney animator John Lasseter, and getting funding from Steve Jobs himself, they were pretty set up for success. So, Pixar decided to make Toy Story in 1995 in collaboration with Disney, as this big, fully CG film. And if you haven't heard, it's kind of a big deal, kind of a successful movie, $300 million at the box office. And at the same time that Pixar continued to release hit after hit with A Bug's Life, Monsters Inc., and Finding Nemo, Disney was putting out 2D animated films like Atlantis and Treasure Planet, which did a fraction of the numbers they were expecting. Treasure Planet actually losing money at the box office, which would continue to be a trend for Disney into the 2000s. Being in such a hole, Disney actually laid off hundreds of people from their animation division, going from 2,200 employees in 1999 to just 600 in 2006. And with bomb after bomb, they cut down more and more until they eventually closed their final 2D studio in 2004, deciding it would be smarter to just acquire Pixar instead and go all in on CG. And this isn't a decision made alone. At the same time as this, DreamWorks had had an unexpected hit in Shrek, and Blue Sky had put out Ice Age to similar success. Pretty much every major feature film studio was seeing dollar signs in their eyes thinking about 3D. So over the course of only about 5 years, the entire animation industry just completely shifted focus, from traditional to computer generated, which fractures the already divided talent pool in the West, driving that final nail in the coffin. Before, you could at least start at a children's show and work your way up to a film, hone your talents and build your resume. But now, every Disney Pixar type animator had to work in this other medium. They had to learn a completely different skill set. The talents didn't transfer over all that well, and 3D was something only the expensive studios could get away with, because on a TV budget, you couldn't really pull it off without looking like Jimmy Neutron.
See, I'm a genius, but sometimes I'm too smart for my own good.
Now, there was talent coming back from Disney to make animated shows. The previously mentioned James Baxter actually guest animated on Gravity Falls and Adventure Time, and a lot of these series look great. But none of this talent really spread around the industry, it just pooled back at the top. So when the demand for shows kept increasing, there weren't enough people to keep up with it. The industry buckled and let the floor drop out from under it, letting the cheapest and worst looking shows get so much worse. The 2000s especially being plagued by gross flash animation, barely legible 3D, and tons of overly simple designs. Compare this to anime and it's almost the complete opposite. Even with these advancements in technology, anime was stubborn and adhered to the traditional hand-drawn style. 2D characters and backgrounds still to this day are what most anime studios focus on. Aside from the few entirely CG companies like Orange and Sanzigen, which are rare and not the most successful. The way anime did incorporate CG and digital effects then was in assistance to the 2D drawings. Complex mechanical objects or big camera moves or tons of extras in a background, anything that would be a pain in the ass to draw by hand was modeled in 3D instead. And beauty shots were given a healthy dose of post-processing, something done by pretty much every studio as they all tried to figure out the best way to incorporate it. So, ironically, where CG became the big selling point of Western animation, something only the top studios could do that drew in tons of money, CG in anime became sort of a taboo, seen as a cheap cost-saving measure that you could rely on instead of drawing, but one that many studios had access to. And of course, the studios kept improving it, blending in this new tech until eventually we get to a point where even the big Sakuga moments in shows are only possible because of 3D camera work or computer-generated effects. Pretty much any big production will have tons of this, and even projects from smaller studios can utilize it well, with most of it looking fine by this point. Though the bad stuff is all you'll ever notice. Again, Western animation at its best looks way better than almost anything anime can put out. It has much larger budgets, much bigger teams, more cutting-edge tech. It's always been incredibly hard for anime to compare to the best of what the likes of Disney can do, or what the team behind Spider-Verse is currently doing. And that will probably remain the case for a while. But the worst of what the West can do is also much worse than anime, because those resources are not shared nearly as much, and the expected floor of quality is much lower. So when we focus on specifically adult productions, you can start to see what happens. That entire ceiling of quality that big Western shows are pushing upward just doesn't carry over. Adult animations don't get movies. Nobody at Pixar is making something rated higher than PG. Even Arcane, as an outlier, was a French studio that had to expand basically from scratch to meet the production requirements, going from 15 employees to over 300 by the time the show was done, something that could only be accomplished with tons of funding from Riot Games and Netflix and 6 years to make a show. Most adult animation is left on the lower rungs of TV, which can get really bad, where adult anime crosses the entire spectrum. In fact, the most popular demographic is shonen, which leans into adult territory all the time. It's just much easier for mature works to get funding and talent behind them. And even when they don't, that floor of quality is still much higher. But that's not enough. That's a very generalized answer about the nature of the whole industry. I think we can do a little better, so why don't we get into the nitty-gritty of how this stuff is actually made. Starting off with the software, we can see that in order to keep up with demand, lower-end animation in the West has basically ditched the traditional hand-drawn style completely. In fact, the main program that most American shows are animated in nowadays is something called Toon Boom, which does allow for traditional work, but also something called rigging, which is infinitely more common. Rig animation, or puppet animation as it's sometimes called, is when you draw and render out a single character in a bunch of different angles and with a bunch of different preset faces and poses, and then instead of having to redraw that character every time you want them to move, you can just move the rig around and the software will fill in the gaps. Change the mouth position to a bunch of presets to get the character to talk, swap in different arms and postures. You basically don't have to do any drawing work beyond the initial puppet creation. Now, the list of shows animated in this software is huge. The Simpsons, Big Mouth, Bob's Burgers, Archer, you can look up and find more, it's basically all of them, but the shows that specifically use rigging can be pretty obvious when you see them, because this puppet that you're confining a character to makes the movements much more stiff. It makes everything weirdly smooth and robotic, because a lot of the in-between frames of movements are handled automatically by the program. With enough effort, you can get it to look expressive and dynamic, but that takes a lot of work that these shows typically don't have the time or budget for. The main reason to use puppet animation, beyond the fact that traditional animators are in short supply, is efficiency. It's an obviously efficient way to make something. But without proper care, it results in what I just call the animated sitcom look. Very little actual movement, very few poses, basically zero changes in perspective, just a lot of characters sliding around on one flat plane. Ironically, it's still following the Western animation philosophy of consistency and fluidity above all else, just on a level where that's to the show's detriment. Something that is not helped by the fact that 99% of these are edgy comedies. They're trying to look, sound, and be vulgar, which means the art styles they choose are all just fucking hideous. A show like Big Mouth can say it gets away with having ugly characters because it's about puberty. It can say it looks like shit stylistically on purpose, that's the joke. But when the technical animation is also very limited, I just have to ask why. Ren and Stimpy looked ugly a lot of the time, but clearly had inventive and stylistic drawings and movement. Archer has very limited puppets for characters, but they have an interesting style that the show leans on. Something like Hoops, well, that just looks bad and is animated badly. It has zero redeeming visual qualities. Anyway, anime isn't much different from a software perspective. Companies don't really give out what program they use, and it varies much more from studio to studio. Ghibli actually created one called OpenTunes that they modified from an existing product. And one of the biggest applications in the industry for a while was Animo, used by Madhouse, Gainax, and a lot of other studios during their switch from physical cells to digital, a software which, funnily enough, was bought by Toon Boom in 2009. The most popular program, though, is Retas, made by Celsius, who went on to make Clip Studio Paint. Not that it matters, though, it is all just software. What anime does with it is much more important here. The workflow of anime productions is very traditional, very closely in line with what most people think animation is. We've added CG and digital effects and new software to the mix, but the core workflow really hasn't changed in like 80 years. They storyboard a scene, making a rough animatic that matches with the recorded dialogue and pacing of an episode, including all the shots and angles they want. And then, instead of rigging anything, they'll have key animators draw certain poses and movements that the characters hit, and get in-betweeners to draw all the individual frames that fill out those movements. So one person draws a punch being cocked back, then the punch landing, and a team of people draw the movement of the punch itself, while other teams of people draw the backgrounds and objects and stuff. Creating everything by hand like this is obviously much more time-consuming. But again, consider that anime is still very limited. Main characters will only move at around 12 out of the available 24 frames a second, and a background object might get 8 or even less. Sakuga tends to increase this frame rate for the big hype scenes, but a normal episode or downtime scene in a movie is going to be pretty choppy compared to the full frame stuff out of the United States. What's kind of interesting about this when you look at lower end productions of anime is that the problems in their visuals typically stem from one of these individual processes failing. Keyframes that look weird or are poorly paced out, in between animation that feels wonky or stiff, or just CG that stands out horribly. A workflow of drawing every frame allows for some of the most dynamic shots and poses and cuts out there, but at its worst looks dynamic in a bad way. A character looking up and their face sliding around because the in-betweener couldn't keep the position of their features consistent. Something that almost never happens in bad Western shows, because the models are pinned to these always consistent rigs. Now, preference for something consistent or dynamic is gonna be up to the individual. I'm sure there are people who really like either one, but in my humble opinion, that traditional workflow is almost always gonna beat out puppeted animation. Not only is the potential so much higher, where you can get crazy Demon Slayer shots if you're talented enough, but even at its worst, it's still doing much more. There are particular shots of anime that might look terrible, don't get me wrong, but there are basically 0 Japanese animated shows I can think of that look less interesting than Big Mouth across a whole episode. So, who's behind this? If you've ever seen those dozens of videos out there ripping apart adult animated comedies and decided to look into who actually makes these shows, it's actually surprising how few names are involved. I mean, first of all, congrats on having to dig through credits and Wikipedia pages, because while database websites like MyAnimeList exist, nothing similar is really out there for stuff out of the States. From what I've found, typically American studios that end up working on adult animation will specialize in it, and that's the only kind of show they'll make. Which makes sense from everything we've learned so far. The super big programs like The Simpsons, Family Guy, and Archer are all done basically in-house with a network-funded company. But because the resources and talent have been so limited, this leaves the viable studios doing all of the other stuff down to just a few. And I'll just go through some notable ones. You've got Shadow Machine, who started with Robot Chicken and went on to make Final Space and BoJack Horseman, Powerhouse, who have done Blood of Zeus and Castlevania, then the real big names, like Titmouse, who have done Metalocalypse, Venture Bros, Big Mouth, Chicago Party Ant, Star Trek Lower Decks, Q-Force, Midnight Gospel, Pantheon, Scavenger's Reign, and The Boys Diabolical. And don't forget Bento Box, who've worked on Bob's Burgers, Brickleberry, Hoops, The Prince, Paradise PD, Crapopolis, Has-Been Hotel, and Smiling Friends. Now, there's some collaboration going on in some of these, typically a studio helping out with the animators already helming a show. Has-Been and Smiling Friends are good examples of that. But you can clearly see that a handful of studios produce most of the stuff out there. Actually, next time you watch one of these, a fun game I like to play is looking at all the production credits that pop up at the end, because it's almost always one big studio and then like 5 production companies that just belong to one person each. Rick and Morty being an absolute clusterfuck of this, because Justin Roiland has a company, Dan Harmon has a company, and the show changed hands like 3 times. Actually, side tangent, this video is long already, who cares? Rick and Morty started with Starburns Industries, formed by the guy who played Starburns on Community, who has the world record for longest name, so I'm not even going to attempt it. He actually created the company to make the animated stop-motion Christmas special for Community, then got hired by Dan Harmon from that to produce Rick and Morty. But after the first season came out to success, Starburns Industries was contacted by the Animation Guild and tried to unionize. So conveniently, Rick and Morty LLC was formed by the same people in the same building as a shell company to produce the second season. That is 100% real. Justin Roiland has gone on record saying fuck the union. I'll link the article in the description, it's insane. So, Rick and Morty LLC then later voted to unionize, and in 2019 the production shifted hands to Green Portal Productions, Yet another shell company also owned by the same people. And that's the credit that pops up on season 4 onwards. The motivations behind the creation of these companies are all unknown, so everything I'm saying is alleged, but like, come on. Anyways, those few companies I talked about are the main drivers behind everything. And the range of quality is kinda shocking. I mean, Shadow Machine animated BoJack Horseman and Flash, then won an Oscar for making Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio. Titmouse is behind Big Mouth, but also Scavenger's Reign. It doesn't seem to make sense. But keep in mind that these companies are essentially just conglomerates of animators and creators. They're not monoliths. Almost all of them are split up among several locations and have hundreds of employees, and the work they do is almost entirely based on contracts. Titmouse, for example, was actually founded by one Chris Prynoski, who got his start submitting a student film to Ralph Bakshi, who hooked him up with a gig at MTV where he worked on Beavis and Butthead. He only founded Titmouse to get more work, and the majority of what they did before Metalocalypse was commercials, opening graphics, animated bits. Even after getting successful, you'd probably be surprised to find out they're the studio responsible for the openings of Afro Samurai and Avatar: The Last Airbender. Then look at Powerhouse, now known for Castlevania, and they started with commercials for Old Spice and the cutscenes for Disney's Epic Mickey. Just random stuff to pay the bills before landing something substantial with a juicy Netflix contract. Animated shows are the big catches that these companies get, but as companies with tons of employees, Titmouse now hiring over 700 people, they're pretty much just creators for hire. They can make good shows, they can make bad shows, they certainly have the resources to produce amazing stuff, as we've seen. But it all ultimately comes down to the people actually leading the project. Is it an artist who wants to make something cool and has the budget to do that? Or is it a comedian/writer getting funded by a streaming service to crank something out? Sadly, the latter is a lot more common than the former. Contract work and odd jobs, I should point out, are just how most of the industry worldwide operates, and anime is actually no different. In fact, the way that anime is specifically produced is based on production committees, where several companies will come together to fund a project and then split its earnings if it's successful. So for a small thing like a commercial, it's usually a single company contracting out a studio, but for a large TV show or movie, it can be dozens of big names, usually involving big publishing companies like Kodansha if it's a manga adaptation, or whatever TV network might air the thing. But because of everything we've talked about, it should be apparent that the work anime studios do is much more varied. A company like WIT might do a season of Attack on Titan and then a Pokemon movie. Trigger does Little Witch Academia and a cyberpunk show. It's still this contract-based process, but pretty much any studio can do whatever at this point, only really sticking to one thing if that's what they're known for or good at. And that actually brings up a bit of the problem, or at least alludes to it, because we've just covered how the adult animation industry in America is a lot smaller than you might think it is, but the industry as a whole in Japan is relatively small too. And yet there is a lot of anime coming out. Over 300 shows every year for the past half a decade, with over 200 of those being new series. And that's not even counting movies. Even just condensing down to stuff made for adults, again using the metric of what would be considered adult in America, I counted at least 70 individual shows put out in 2023 alone. For comparison, in the West, there were less than 25. Having touched on how valuable a resource talented workers are for a studio, you've really got to wonder how the anime industry can crank out so much stuff, despite how high the bar of quality they've raised is, especially when their workflow seems to be much more demanding. Writing this video, I've kinda had this idea in the back of my mind that I'm hyping up anime too much as superior to American stuff, something I'm very much not trying to do. I'm trying to be fair here. But with everything I've talked about when it comes to culture and workflow that still sort of creeps in, I like anime, I can't help it. It looks good, it's more varied, it's great. So in order to balance things out a little more, why don't we go even deeper into how this stuff is made? The real behind the scenes of the industry. Shed some light on how they're able to produce so much stuff. Sound fun? Alright, let's go. Part 3. Animators in Japan make less than $300 a month. In the 1960s, having recently left Toei to found his own studio, Osamu Tezuka made quite a few interesting decisions. See, when establishing Mushi Productions as this big new thing, Tezuka started with only about 5 employees. Looking to get more, the ever-eccentric animator famously decided to go back to Toei and poach some talent. The way he did this, though, was just by going up to people he previously worked with and offering to almost triple their salary if they left and moved to Mushi. This worked fantastic for obvious reasons, and Tezuka was, by all accounts, a very generous boss during these early days. So generous, in fact, that he was funding the entire studio out of pocket from all the revenue he was making as a manga author, something he was hoping to make back with the creation of Astro Boy, but something that ultimately just left him in a lot of debt. When it came time to sell Astro Boy to a TV network, things didn't look up either. The company Tezuka pitched to, Manensha, was an advertising agency that agreed to purchase the airtime required for the full series. But when asked how much they were willing to fund each episode, their first offer was only 300,000 yen, which for reference was only $800 in 1960, a staggering quarter of what even Hanna-Barbera cartoons were made for, which was already considered unreasonably cheap at the time. Manensha's view was that that's how much it cost to license the rights to pre-made cartoons from America, so it's how much they wanted to pay Tezuka for domestically produced animation. Tezuka obviously objected, but they weren't hearing it. So using one of his colleagues' brothers, who worked at Fuji TV at the time, Tezuka managed to put together a production committee that would facilitate Astro Boy getting on the air, and thus lighten the load. Though being desperate to get his studio off the ground and finally be a big shot animator, the god of manga only negotiated Manensha up to 550,000 yen an episode, or about $1,500, a rate that was still lower than any other studio even in Japan was willing to work for, which got his foot in the door, sure, but may also be responsible for most of the problems in the anime industry. I've talked about how Astro Boy was so influential that we attribute Tezuka with the birth of limited anime as we know it. But limited anime only exists because he couldn't fucking afford to do it any other way. Tezuka's assistant, Yamamoto Eiichi, once calculated that if they wanted to produce Toei-level animation on a TV schedule, they would need a budget of about 60 million yen and more animators than Japan even had at the time. So they cut down massively, getting to an average of about 2,500 cells an episode, or less than 2 per second, with Tezuka himself saying he got it down to 1,200 cells at one point, which is insanely low. Contemporaries compared it to a radio broadcast with occasional slideshow images. But even with that, Mushi Productions still couldn't handle the work. So they outsourced things like backgrounds and in-betweens to other nearby studios. Those other studios then found out they were massively under-equipped because, keep in mind, TV anime was brand new at this point, so they outsourced to other studios. Pretty much the entirety of Astro Boy during even its first episodes was made by people outside of Mushi Pro. Basically everyone working in anime at the time, because they would all get contracted to help. Many of them even working on the show as a freelancer late at night after a shift at another company. Help only arrived when American networks finally caught wind of Astro Boy's success and wanted to license it, offering an additional 300,000 yen an episode, which was still much lower than normal due to the show being broadcast on cheap time slots as a loss leader in the States. But it was enough to keep their production afloat. And boy oh boy, I cannot stress how fucked up it was that the first anime to get big in Japan was made for this cheap. Because everyone ran to copy Tezuka, everyone wanted a show on the air. It was incredibly popular, but the networks were used to paying pennies on the dollar, so all of these other studios and early shows had to be made competitive with Astro Boy, and all of them had to find out the hard way just how much that sucked. Even Mushi Pro knew this wasn't sustainable. They switched to color with Kimba the White Lion and sold more episodes to American networks, but Tezuka was still funding them out of pocket and then just paying off his debts with the earnings. Earnings that were quickly split in half when Astro Boy was no longer the only anime on TV. The funds they got were still abysmal, the budgets weren't enough, the show was too much work, and in a last-ditch effort, Tezuka wanted to make a series of films for adults that would hopefully tap a previously untapped market. So they make Anime Rama, Belladonna of Sadness, and it just doesn't make its money back. There is probably enough to say here for an entire video essay on just this moment in time when Mushi Productions went under. How it sort of encapsulates Tezuka's desire to be a Disney-like figure by gambling on a big project just like they had with Snow White. How it mirrors the struggle that America had to get adult animation made. How it just completely fucked the anime industry forever. But all you need to know is that it did. Tezuka, for all the things that he's known for, might honestly have left the biggest impact with the 3 things that every anime studio after him had to deal with: tiny budgets, long hours, and tons of outsourcing. The industry standard that Astro Boy set, that anime followed, was to charge less than it costs to make. This is why production committees exist, to gather up sponsors and companies willing to fund a show. It's why so much anime gets pumped out, and it leads to all of the other problems in the industry. The demand for anime has only gone up over the years, but from the beginning, it was an unsustainable business model, rife with exploitation. Getting a bit into the production committee aspect, the way anime gets funded is a lot like a publicly traded company, with investors pitching in a certain amount to get a certain percentage of control over production. The more investors there are, the more they share the load, and the more they share the pot if something makes it big. This committee approach to things might honestly seem very clever, but something you might not realize is that a surprising amount of the time, the studio animating a show or movie isn't on the committee. They are being paid a flat rate to make it, which, like we just went over, is not much. And they get nothing out of it if what they make is successful. All those merch sales and figures and royalties, that goes to the producers, the investors. The animators get squat. Even worse is that because committees are the norm and there are a handful of big companies that will fund a lot of these projects, they will literally just collude with each other to cap the budget of a show, agreeing to not spend over a certain amount, even if it's a guaranteed hit that tons of people would love to throw money at. Mostly because these companies want to maintain a certain percentage of control, a certain percentage of that profit. So they'll give, say, $500,000 and want 50%, and all the other companies will agree to not push that budget over $1 million. They will go so far as to convince outside investors who want to spend a lot on a single anime to instead split that money and put it into multiple different projects, just to make sure that they can maintain a majority stake in that committee. Meaning instead of one thing made for a large budget, we'll get 10 things made at the normal low rate. This is a major reason why there is so much anime produced every year. The more money that goes into the industry, the more they split it up instead of increasing budgets, leading to the studios working on all this to have basically not seen a raise in years, while they still have to underbid on projects in order to get picked to make them. And don't even take my word for this. I'm getting all of this info bar for bar from Toshio Okada, the co-founder of Gainax, who talked about it in a YouTube video I'll link in the description.
結果ひたすらアニメーションの企画が増えるばっかりだ。出資すべき金はいっぱいあるんだけども、1本あたりのアニメーションには全然お金が増えない。そして横の方にお金が縦に流れて、奥の方のスタッフまで行くんではなくて、横に流れて上の方ばっかりで滞留することになってしまうわけだ。
Then one of the other norms that's come about since the birth of anime has been that outsourcing thing we talked about. Since the beginning, it has become normalized for anime studios to, I guess the best word is collaborate with each other, where one will get a contract or win a bid to produce a show, they'll assign their team of in-house key animators, storyboarders, directors, and then unless they're a massive company, they'll leave most of the rest of the work to freelancers and support studios. Support studios being companies that exist entirely just to help out with other projects, being how a lot of the big names in the industry like Kyoto Animations and Trigger got their start. This is why there are so many freelance animators in Japan, by the way. About half the industry is unaffiliated contract work. And if you look at like any big anime being made right now, you will find so much outsourced help. Like, let's just look at an example like Mushoku Tensei Season 1. This season is credited to Studio Bind, who was a spin-off of White Fox, who was on the production committee. However, when looking at the credits, there are employees from 25 other studios listed as having helped with secondary key animation. 9 studios are listed for background art, and 27 studios are listed for in-betweens. Most of these are for single episodes, with anywhere from 1 to 10 people from each studio, so it's not like these companies are all devoting their entire staff to the show, but that is still a lot of outside help. Maybe a bit of a high number, 27 is kind of insane, though there are startlingly few series that will have less than a dozen additional studios listed in the credits somewhere. I'd actually challenge you to find a show you like with less than that. It's pretty rare. Part of the way that anime creators have coped with having no money and insanely tight deadlines has been subcontracting out work, so they don't have to retain a full staff. Kyoto Animations being one of very few studios that actually has salaried employees trained in-house, and so a good amount of outsourcing stays within Japan. Work basically just getting bounced around from company to company. But there is also help coming from overseas, most commonly Korea, India, the Philippines, and Taiwan, places that have rather large workforces but not as much demand for animation. Just one with a name I like, a Korean studio named Dr. Movie, has, according to Anime News Network, their hands in over 700 productions. Backgrounds on an episode here, in-betweens on a movie there. They have worked on pretty much everything you can imagine. They're even partly owned by Madhouse, and there are big outsourcing studios all over the world like this. Now, the quick and easy assumption is that these exist to reduce costs. pay animators overseas less, and pocket more of the profit. And I'm certain that's definitely happening, but honestly, they don't need to, because Japanese animators get paid like shit as it is. The average salary for an animator in their 20s in Japan, according to a recent study, was 1.5 million yen, or just about $1,100 a month, closer to 800 after the value of the yen went down, which is notably 1 million yen a year less than the national average. For reference, if you got a minimum wage job at McDonald's in Tokyo the same year that study was conducted, you would have made over 2 million yen. Because, importantly, most people working in anime are freelancers, doing contract work with different companies, getting paid per cut or sometimes per frame drawn rather than a flat salary, something that even carries over into full-time studio positions, leading to wildly inconsistent monthly payouts. A channel that I really love, the Animator Dormitory Project, had one first-year animator share their earnings in 2019, where it was shown that they had made an average of 74,000 yen a month, or about $700, less than $500 by today's rate, with her lowest month's pay, not counting one where she took time off, being under 300 USD. The craziest part of that video being that she explains how that's relatively high compared to other people she's talked to, who can make less than $300 a month average. She was only able to make how much she did because she was a key animator with a full-time job at one studio and was freelancing on the side. This is literally why animator dormitories exist. They're set up to get outside, sometimes crowdsourced funding to allow animators to live there for cheap, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to afford rent in the city they're working in. And because of these low wages and the general drive that people have to make it in this industry, the average monthly hours worked in anime is 219 every month. 40 hours higher than the national average, at about 10 hours a day with weekends, 7 hours a day if you work 7 days a week. The anime industry is, by all metrics, one of the worst places to work. It starts less than minimum wage. You work insane hours. Even at higher levels of production, you're not making anything close to what you should be for the work involved. Tetsuya Akatsu, an animator who worked themselves up to episode director on shows like Jujutsu Kaisen, made only $1,400 to $3,800 a month. So there's zero incentive to move up the ranks, other than a love for anime. And that's what drives the entire industry. That otaku culture that I brought up is essentially keeping the whole of anime afloat. People grow up watching shows they like and will do anything to make them. So the producers and companies can get away with terrible pay and worse conditions. They can weaponize that passion to exploit their workers. Something they do all the time. In 2020, Studio Trigger lost a lawsuit from a former employee for abusing labor laws and not paying them overtime. In 2019, an employee of Studio 4C won a lawsuit for $26,000 in unpaid wages, after working a reported 393 hours a month. Jujutsu Kaisen 0, an award-winning film, was made in only 4 months, according to people who worked on it, with the studio, MAPPA, taking on up to 6 projects at one time, and paying as low as $25 a cut on one of them that was made for Netflix. Crunch and terrible working conditions, unfortunately, seem to be prevalent in every creative industry. I've talked about it at length for video game companies. American animation has had its own problems, with people leaving Spider-Verse after working 11-hour days. I even found a Twitter thread from an animator on the adult cartoon Hoops that says they almost had a mental breakdown trying to keep up with the show's unhealthy schedule. But just for comparison, in a very rare case of America coming out on top, according to the US Department of Labor, the median salary for an animator is $100,000 a year, with the lowest 10% still making $4,700 a month. Freelancers are obviously bound to make less with more varied payouts, and they still make up a good chunk of the workforce, but no numbers you'll find online will even come anywhere close to anime. In fact, Titmouse, Bento Box, and a lot of the studios that make these shows we're talking about are largely unionized. Titmouse in particular setting a precedent with the first IATSE animation branch in both New York and Canada. The Animation Guild, if you look on their website, covers pretty much every American studio I've mentioned so far, in at least some capacity. A lot of these places are still terrible, I'm sure. I don't want to gloss over the actual struggles of artists just because statistically they're better off than what might be the worst workplace on earth. But it is so important when we're comparing anime to Western animation, we have to consider the cost. More anime comes out every year, it looks great, it's got more going on, and the people making it can barely afford to feed themselves. So what the hell does that have to do with adult animation? Well, remember that whole outsourcing thing? America actually does that too. Labor is more expensive in the US, like we just saw, and they have a relatively small workforce outside of the big studios, so they've been contracting animation out internationally since before Astro Boy. Rocky and Bullwinkle, back in 1959, got piped out to a company called Gamma Productions in Mexico. Hanna-Barbera started Taiwanese studio Wang Film in 1978 to help out with almost all their shows. And nearly everything Rankin Bass ever made was actually done by Toei Animation, Topcraft, who later became Ghibli, and Mushi Production themselves. Actually, the specific way that American animation developed over the years was that they essentially abandoned in-betweens and some other small parts like coloring and backgrounds entirely, either through software that does some of it for you or by sending it off to another studio. Recently, a lot of both. The most common format that you'll see is that the storyboards and rough animatics are done in-house at whatever credited studio, maybe even some key animation, and then they'll ship that off to Korea or Taiwan to get the finished product. Then just tweak things here and there and maybe redraw some mistakes.
So what we do down here in animatics is we receive the boards as they've been drawn to the audio that we get from Seth down in the booth. And it's our job to assemble it into a rough cut of the show so the writers can gauge what timing is working, if the jokes are funny, for the revision process so that they can rewrite it.
After revisions, the mock-ups are sent off to Korea where the final animation process is completed.
I just want to be clear here. Every show you can think of does some variation of this. Every show I've listed since the 90s for sure. Family Guy, The Simpsons, Ren and Stimpy, Rick and Morty, King of the Hill, Bob's Burgers, Big Mouth, everything. Even more unique stuff like The Max, Aeon Flux, Has-Been Hotel, Boondocks. Even great-looking things like Scavenger's Reign and Castlevania. The amount of work outsourced varies, but they're all doing it. The US adult animation industry just doesn't have enough manpower to make any of this on its own. So isn't it interesting that anime is starting to become more popular? We spend a lot of time talking about how adult anime is so far ahead of Western cartoons culturally, and how it can look a lot better, and how it's made for cheap. So if it costs so little to make, and it's more popular than even domestic shows in the US, why would you ever spend money on adult animation? Why not just pay the anime studios to make all that for you? Fairly recently, we've started to see an increase in anime adaptations of Western properties. Things like Blade Runner, Black Lotus, Cyberpunk Edgerunners, Suicide Squad Isekai, the new Terminator Zero coming out soon. And this has been a thing for a while. You might remember the Animatrix back in the day, or Marvel Anime from the 2010s. What started as collaboration between industries, fresh takes on existing properties, has started to seem like it has another purpose. One that we can clear up with just how many anime originals companies like Netflix and Crunchyroll are funding and producing. It's 129, by the way, in the case of Netflix. They are working very hard to put out as much anime as possible during its boom in popularity. And as we know from insider reports from the studios they hire like MAPPA, they're getting these shows for dirt cheap. We know the reason that adult cartoons became focused on comedy during their inception, but I think one of the reasons they haven't branched out as much since then has been because they have to compete with anime. American sitcoms are a unique thing that only the US can really make. But everything else? Well, I can just go to Japan for that. The popularity of anime has increased the demand for adult shows, but they've also filled it better than North America can. Without anime existing, I'm sure American studios would have done more to increase variety, but they don't have to, because we can just import anime instead. And as producers, places like Netflix can just pay a fraction of what a domestic show would cost. No studio in the US can compete with the well-oiled exploitation machine that is Japan's animation space, especially not with the yen at an all-time low. Even if they tried to lower their budgets to meet the absurd standard Tezuka set, they're not equipped to deal with the limitations that come with that. It's no wonder we're seeing so many shows come out like Castlevania or Tomb Raider that so clearly want to make you think they're anime. They're not just doing that from a place of insecurity, though that is certainly a part of it, they're doing it from a genuine need to compete. Being considered an anime is one of the only ways that other forms of adult animation can fit in. We've been so ravenously consuming this media, promoting anime to the top of the list, that we've lost sight of how it's being used against the people making it. If we want American adult animation to get to a place where it can truly be on par with the best Japan has to offer, I don't think we should do that by dragging it down to the worst of how Japan treats its creators. That's certainly what Netflix wants, that works out best for them, but if things keep going that way, you're gonna see the House of Cards start to collapse. I would love to see a future where these industries can be on the same level, not just in terms of quality or variety of work or the cultural acceptance of each, but from a place where they're made fairly, where the people making them can be rewarded for doing so, where the productions can be adequately funded. And I think that working together to achieve that is a hell of a lot better than being in competition with one another. Looking at how adult anime and adult cartoons grew up and how they turned out the way they did, it's a lot harder for me to say that one is better than the other. And hopefully it's harder for you too. In many ways, they're both very far ahead of where they've come from. And in many ways, they're both very far behind. So the next time someone says the words adult animation, I don't want you to think of terrible quality or rushed productions. I want you to think of the people working hard to give this medium the respect it deserves. Because they deserve it too.
それねちょっと違うんですね。空白があったっていうのはね僕が金がなかったっていうこと一つあるんですかね。もうつまり虫プロがなくなったんで相当金が表に出されてしまったということは一つあるんですけどね。一つはね僕は栗さんが登場してそれからその他に草月アートフェスティバルでもういろんなそのアニメ作家が登場してですねもう僕はこの人たちがもう日本のアニメを背負ってくれるんだというね安心感があったんです。で僕はもうそこではっきり言うともう虫プロにも興味なかったし虫プロの作ってるアニメ特にテレビアニメ界にもほとんど興味なくてねもうはっきり言うとアニメはもうあと一生に1本ぐらい作ればいいと思うぐらいもうはっきり言うと割り切ってたんです。しかしその後ねテレビアニメの方はもちろんこれはどんどんなんか僕の意図と反して違う方向に行ってしまったし劇場アニメもそうですね視聴率稼いでマーチャンダイジングを増やしてお金を入れるためにやったつまんない仕事多いですね。それはもうそれからなんていうかしがらみでね作ったっていうのもありますしね。実験アニメはそういうことないです。実験アニメは全て僕の懐から出る金で作るわけだからやっぱりもう必死になって作りますからねそういういい加減なものは作らないですよ。テレビアニメはもうやっぱりそういう意味では最低でしょうな。もうしょうがないですかね。